Okay, and with that, we will now move on to our next topic, which will be review and analysis of ballot rejection rates. A thorough report was done in 2020, so we're here to get a presentation from the state auditor as well as the Evans School of Public Policy. And while staff brings them up on the Zoom screen, we're joined at the dais with a representative-elect and a current state representative. So if they want to quickly introduce themselves with their name and district, that would be great.
State Representative Bill Ramos with the 5th Legislative District. Thank you.
Representative-elect Daria Farivar from the 46th Legislative District. Thank you.
And Representative Farivar, whose seat are you taking?
The good chair seat.
All right. Does staff have the folks ready to go?
Yes, we are.
All right, wonderful. So we are now going to bring up Scott Nelson, Scott Frank, and Michael HUYNH. Hopefully I pronounced your name correctly. Oh, you're here in person. For some reason I was thinking you were Zoom.
It's a new experience for us, Mr. Chair.
Please introduce yourself and start your presentation. I think staff will get your presentation on the screen and it's ready to go. Perfect.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. I'm Scott Nelson, the Director of Legislation and Policy Affairs for the State Auditor. A little closer. There we go. With me is Scott Frank, the Director of Performance and IT Audit. And just to be different from the Scott trend, we brought a Michael along. Michael HUYNH is a program manager now for the use of deadly force program, Representative Ramos, and was the lead auditor for the ballot rejection rate. So with that, I'll give it over to Scott.
Thank you. I'm Scott Frank. I'm the Director of Performance and IT Audit for the Washington State Auditor. We're here today to talk about an audit report that we issued towards the beginning of this year, taking a look at the rejection rates for ballots here in Washington. Before we begin, I just wanted to thank this audit involved a lot of cooperation from the Secretary of State's office as well as numerous county auditors around the state, and so we want to thank them for their help with this. I'm going to hand this off to Mike. He's going to kind of give you some background on the system, although you may be familiar with that, and then a little bit into the audit, and he'll kick it back to me a little bit later.
Well, thank you, Scott. Hello, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is Michael HUYNH. I'm a program manager for the Auditor's Office, and I was one of the lead auditors on this project. So Washington is one of the few states that votes entirely by mail. Counties carry out elections with help from the Secretary of State's office. They mail every single voter a ballot, and voters have until election day to fill it out, sign it, and return it. Counties verify ballots were returned on time and use the signature on the ballot to confirm the vote is valid. So ballots are rejected for 3 main reasons. First, the ballot is either returned late or postmarked after Election Day. The ballot envelope is missing a voter signature, or the ballot signature does not match the voter signature on file. So for signature issues, officials try to cure the ballot, or they reach out to voters and try to resolve the issue before the election is certified. Overall, ballot rejection is pretty rare. Out of the more than 4.2 million ballots cast in the 2020 general election, only about 29,000 were rejected for signature issues, or less than 1%. So despite its low occurrence, it's important to make sure ballots are accepted and rejected appropriately. Some rejection is necessary to make sure only valid votes are counted. And to gain a better understanding of ballot rejections in Washington, the legislature included a requirement in the 2020 operating budget for our office to conduct a performance audit on rejected ballots. Specifically, we were asked to compare county processes to laws and leading practices, to examine the accuracy of ballot rejections, to analyze demographics of voters who had ballots rejected, and then to make related recommendations. So to address these requirements, we conducted the following work. We compared the policies procedures and practices at 10 counties to laws and leading practices. This included 5 counties with higher rejection rates and 5 counties with lower rejection rates. And then to analyze the appropriateness of ballot rejections, we reviewed a sample of ballot signatures on accepted and rejected ballots and compared them to voter signatures on file. And then finally, to analyze voter demographics of those who had ballots rejected, we conducted various analyses on all ballots submitted during the 2020 general election. So after conducting this work, we found, in summary, that 1, the 10 counties we looked at in depth followed most requirements and used many leading practices. 2, that county determinations on ballot acceptance and rejections were mostly appeared appropriate. 3, there were demographic and geographic variations in rejection rates. And then 4, that counties could use additional practices to help reduce rejection rates. So to discuss our results in a little more detail, we found that the 10 audited counties met most legal requirements, including all requirements related to ballot processing and curing, and that 3 counties did not have the legally required number of drop boxes, but they did meet all other voting location requirements. We also found that audited counties used many leading practices. For example, counties used experienced signature reviewers. They had a secondary review of questionable signatures, and they also made multiple attempts to contact voters who had their ballots initially challenged for signature issues. Another practice shared by a couple of counties was telling voters to sign their ballot like they did on their driver's license. And as you can see, the signature is printed right on the license as shown on the slide. The 2 systems are actually linked, so every signature on a driver's license is shown on the voter registration system. And now I'll turn it over to Scott to go over our next 2 results.
So one of the other charges of the mandate was for us to take a look at an evaluation of whether ballots were rejected appropriately. So for this work, we reviewed a random stratified sample of about 7,200 ballots. This included both ballots that had been rejected and also ballots that had been accepted. We wanted to check to see if we concurred in both cases. The sample's drawn from 16 counties. These were the counties that maintain digital images of the signed envelopes when they come in. So those are the ones that would be available for testing. Now, this isn't all counties, obviously, but it represents about 87% of the total ballots that are cast. So in order to perform this testing, one of the things we wanted to do was make sure that our auditors understood how to do this comparison. We're basically going to re-perform the same work that the election officials do. So those auditors took the same training that election officials do. This is offered from the State Patrol. For those 7,200 ballots, the first step was so that we didn't have to waste time on clear matches. We used software that could just compare the images, and so anything that was a clear match, we sort of set aside, and we could just focus on what we were calling questionable, which would be just ones that the software didn't give a real conclusive answer to. Our auditors took a look at that. If they reached a conclusion that they thought the ballot was either accepted or rejected inappropriately, the final stage was to then have officials from the Secretary of State's office who also are experienced at doing this kind of work take a look at it, and if they confirmed and reached the same conclusion we did, then we would consider that the decision we did not concur with. Overall, we agreed with 98% of the signatures we reviewed. This included both 98% of the ones that the counties had decided to accept. We were also seeing the same thing, and also with those that were rejected. So there's a small share there that we had disagreement about, but not very many. One of the things that we did notice in this that will have some significance when we get to the next set of findings is there was one trend that we spotted here, which probably wouldn't be too surprising, which was if you looked at counties that tended to have a high rejection rate, also were less likely to have accepted the ones that were kind of in that questionable category. The ones that were having a lower rejection rate were more likely to have accepted those. And I think that probably flows logically, but we could see that in the results. So So next I want to focus on the questions of demographic disparities, geographic and demographic disparities in the rejection rates. And overall, we saw that the most significant variable related to rejection was the county in which the ballot was cast. We also found higher rejection rates for younger voters, for male voters, and voters from certain racial and ethnic groups, and I will kind of delve into this a little bit more. So we had all of the ballots that had been turned in for the 2020 election. As Mike indicated, more than 4 million ballots. We had a data set with that. We conducted a statistical analysis using combinations of voter data and census data. So we have individual voter data that come from the voter database. So we know the county, the gender, age, voting experience. We have information from that data set. We also have some census data that's not linked to the individual, but is linked to where they live. So we know the median income, high school education, college education, some factors about the demographics of where the voter is from. And then lastly, one of the key variables that we wanted to take a look at was, are there any trends with regard to race and ethnicity? This is not data that is collected for individual voters, and so we had to use a prediction in order to come up with that. And what we're essentially using is a methodology that comes out of like consumer protection field, where you take a person's name, which has probabilities of being associated with certain racial and ethnic groups, and you also know the demographics of where they live, the proportions of people that belong to different groups. And when you meld those two together, you can make a fairly accurate prediction of a person's race or ethnicity. Probably not appropriate if you're just trying to figure out for an individual, make that kind of determination. But when you aggregate that across large groups, like 4 million ballots, it's been shown to be a pretty accurate way of assessing that.
Representative Graham, I saw your hand was up. I'm going to let Mr. Frank finish his discussion, and then I'll get to your question. Is that okay? Okay, got it.
Okay. I jumped the gun and described this slide, so we'll go ahead and move on. So I just kind of want to show a few charts that just sort of illustrate what we're going to show here are what we would call the raw rejection rates, just when we tally up how many ballots, the proportion of ballots that were rejected. We also followed this up with a more detailed statistical analysis that kind of controls for other variables, kind of all things being equal, what do you see? We report these because they're simpler, but the results were the similar trends when we do the deeper, more robust statistical analysis. So here, when you're looking at it by county, you see that there's quite a difference between the rejection rates from counties. So at the high end, you see 1.5% of the ballots being rejected, all the way to the low end, 0.4% of the ballots being rejected. We also saw that younger voters were more likely to have their ballots rejected, far more likely when you get down to the 18 to 21-year-old group versus at the other far end, those that are over the age of 65. So this was a trend, and this is a similar trend that others have seen when they've done research into the rejection rates. We also saw that with that race and ethnicity predictor, we also saw that the rejection rates basically for all non-white racial and ethnic groups was higher than for white voters, with the largest disparity being the difference between black voters versus white voters, where the raw rejection rate was about 4 to 1. Even when we do the statistical analysis, it's not quite as severe, but it was about twice as likely for a black voter to have their ballot rejected as opposed to white voters. So we wanted to delve a little deeper into that because that's to us a fairly troubling finding. And so, why? We don't have a great answer for that, but I wanted to kind of talk about what we did try and look at. So one of the suggestions out there in the research literature is that there may be bias on the part of the election workers, whether that be intentional bias or some unconscious bias of when they're seeing names and trying to do these matches. So referring back to the work we did with the 7,200 ballots where we reperformed the work, the other thing we did was we took a look at a pattern to see, were there any trends in those ballots that were sort of the ones that were in that questionable category that could go either way? Do we see any trends that would indicate bias for or against any racial and ethnic group? We did not see that. So we looked specifically for it, and we did not see evidence of that. And So on the one hand, I suppose that's encouraging. On the other hand, it leaves us with not a lot of answers as to what the cause was. And I know you're going to hear from the Evans School after us. So that was one of the responses to the audit, was the legislature appropriating some money for some additional study in this area to see if we can figure out what the underlying cause is and what we should be doing about that. So I'm going to kick it back to Mike, who's going to talk a little bit about some additional practices that we'd identified that counties may want to apply.
Thank you, Scott. So to help address some of the issues we just discussed, we identified some additional leading practices that counties could consider. First, counties could take more steps to get up-to-date contact information, including email addresses so they could contact voters online. Counties could also take more steps to keep voters informed about vote-by-mail processes, including the specific signature requirements. And then counties could also collect and analyze data so they can target outreach to groups who are more likely to have their ballots rejected and then track those efforts. The audit also identified some more innovative practices that Washington counties could consider. This includes digital clearing. So, for example, Colorado recently started letting voters resolve signature issues directly through their mobile phones. Another is automatic notifications. California started sending notifications automatically to voters regarding their ballot status, when their ballot sent, when it's received, when it's counted, instead of having them log into a website. And last, another option is using unique PIN numbers during voting. So these numbers could be like a driver's license number and collected during voter registration, or it can be more like multi-factor authentication, where a code is sent directly to the voter. So when voting, voters would provide that unique code for verification purposes. This is done in Minnesota for absentee ballots. They look at the PIN number first. If it doesn't match, they turn to the signature and use that for verification. So as a result of this work, we provided a number of recommendations that all counties in Washington should consider. These are detailed in our audit report, but in summary, we recommend that counties increase their voter outreach and education, and that they use data to target outreach and track their efforts. And also that they consider other practices that we identified in the report that could help cure more ballots or reduce the rejection rate. And with that, that concludes our presentation, and we'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. I have a question, but first I want to go to Representative Graham. She had her hand up about 5 minutes ago. So Representative Graham.
Thank you, Chair. This question is for the gentleman in the middle of the panel. I'm sorry I didn't catch your name. And respectfully, when we get our ballots and we fill out the information, there's rules in which that require you to sign it and also to date it. To my knowledge, that rule is the same for everybody. I know I'm careful when I'm filling out my ballot as far as the signature, because if it is really wild, then of course it's going to be rejected. But I would want to ask, should there be some impetus put on the voters when they're filling out their ballots to have responsibility to make sure that they're signing their name to the best of their ability, the same, and also to date it?
Let me think for a second. I guess I would say that from our perspective in doing the audit, what we're trying to do is just take a look at describing what's happening. So I think that, should voters take responsibility for doing that? I mean, I think that would be a judgment as to whether signatures are the right way to verify their identity. And I think under the system, people would have to take that responsibility themselves. What we're simply reporting is that you see most of the time they match. The overwhelming majority of the time they matched. Less than 1% of them were rejected. When we take a look at it, we're confirming, by and large, the decisions that those election officials are making. But we are noting that of those that are rejected, there are trends in there around age, gender, ethnicity, location that do emerge that in some cases would be a bit surprising.
Okay, Vice Chair Lekanoff.
I'll be quick, Mr. Chairman. Following along my colleague's question, when you were talking about the signatures, you match them up to the driver's license signatures. Did I understand you correctly when you're going through your audit?
I'm actually going to let Michael take that because he was
Thank you.
over
Thank
that.
you, sir.
Yeah, we matched it to every signature on file, and that included the signature on their driver's license, as well as their voter registration form.
And their voter's registration form. So, quick question. You were saying there were some recommendations earlier where you were making some suggestions of how we could resolve some of these ballots that are rejected. On the ballot registration, when you come in, does it put a reminder on there to, and I should have looked, I'm sorry, I did not, but does it say on there, you know, when you go to vote, make sure the signature you use here is the same signature you use to sign your ballot? Is there that type of education on the?
Yeah, I believe many counties say that. Yeah, I think the issue is that signatures often change, especially for younger voters, and I think that explains some of the trend amongst age. But on others, there's not much of an explanation.
I was outside of the box thinking. And then did I understand correctly, sir, that rather than using a signature on the driver's license, that we might even consider using and comparing the driver's license number on the ballot rather than the signature, or did I misunderstand you?
That was an example of a unique PIN number that could be used as a verification tool or method, but we weren't suggesting the legislature do
Yes,
that.
sir.
It was just an example.
No, those are good outside of the box thinking. Thank you. Thank you to all three of you.
I do have a question. I'm really concerned about the slide where you showed the breakout by racial and ethnic groups, where a black voter is 4 times more likely to have their ballot rejected than a white voter. And I was wondering if you could maybe, what your data showed in terms of, was it spread out equally throughout all 39 counties, or was it concentrated maybe in one area or another? Just your feedback on that, because that, to me, that's a very troubling finding in your audit.
Yeah, this was for the whole state, that statistic. It was very difficult to break it out by county because some counties have very few black voters or minority voters. So this was a statewide finding.
Yes, Ranking Member Volz.
Yes, thank you. Kind of in the same vein, though, you said you looked at those rejected or accepted ballots, and I think the number was that you concurred with their decision like 98% of the time. So even though the data shows that there is this racial trend or bias or statistical bias, that you confirm the decisions the election workers made almost all the time. So, you know, maybe the solution is some sort of education. You know, how do we get the word out that use the same signature? I struggle with that too, by the way, just because I go by my middle name, and sometimes it's J. Michael, sometimes it's Mike Bolt, sometimes it's, you know, the legal is James M. So I always have to remember how I signed it and had it rejected a couple times when they reached out to me. So do you think that would be a reasonable approach on maybe educate the voter on that a little bit more, or a little bit stronger, a little bit more clarity, put it right on the envelopes, et cetera, that just your thoughts in this process?
Yeah, that's actually one of our recommendations to do that.
Great recommendation. We're going to have 2 more questions. So Representative Gregerson and then Representative Walsh.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm interested in understanding a little bit about the rejected ballots that were actually gone back and cured. And can you tell me a little bit about what that looked like?
So by law, counties are supposed to mail every voter who had their ballot rejected a form to sign another piece of paper again, either because they didn't provide it or it didn't match. So then they use the signature on that cure form to match it to the ballot, and if it matches, they'll accept the ballot. They're also required to call the voter 3 days before the election is certified. Some counties made more attempts than what was required, but that's essentially the process. And we did see that one interesting thing, and that's why we recommended it, was that voters or counties that had up-to-date contact information were more likely to get ballots cured. And they collected information from envelopes every single election to make sure they had up-to-date contact information.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So on those rates, what did it look like when it came to the ethnic makeup of the cured ballots?
Oh, we didn't split it up that far. The numbers just get so small,
Thank you.
the analysis doesn't work well.
Final question for this panel, Representative Walsh.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm troubled, too, by that race and ethnicity screen you had there on the divergent rejected ballots. But you said that was based not on actual self-identified race and ethnicity, but by a model that you used. What are the potential confounding factors and flaws in that model that might have skewed those numbers one way or the other?
Well, I suppose it's a prediction, so you're not going to get it right on everyone. My recollection is that it probably gets it right about 90% of the time, so it's a combination of if you know a person's name, there's a probability distribution that a certain name would be associated with different racial and ethnic groups. And if you know where people live, there's obviously, the census makeup of where they live. And so that gives you also some probabilities, and these two are merged together and gives you a pretty strong prediction. So a potential confounding thing would be if in those 10% that it's going to get wrong, if those have a trend to them that also happens to align with rejections or acceptance, then that would be potentially a confounding factor.
All right, thank you all for taking the time to be here today. We appreciate the work that you've done on this audit and updating us on the results. Thank you so much. We'll have staff now move on and with the next panel up. It's a virtual. It is from some folks from the Evans School of Public Policy and Government at the University of Washington. Go Huskies. And if we could bring them on. Was, but then she left. She left.
Thank you for the opportunity to share our work with you today. My name is Scott Allard. I am the Associate Dean for Research and Engagement and the Daniel J. Evans Endowed Professor of Social Policy at the Evans School of Public Policy and Governance at the University of Washington. Indeed, go Dogs. I'm joined today by ALEXANDRA FOLTZ and CALISTA JAHN, who are members of our team on this project. You should also know that central to our work are other members of the research team, University of Washington political science faculty Megan Ming Francis and Jake Grumbaugh, as well as Kayla Aronowitz, who is the Director of Innovation Engagement at Evans. We've been working closely with the Secretary of State's office around this project, and as well with several county election administrators to this point. So one of the things I wanted to do was just extend my deep thanks to those who supported our work to this point. And Callie, if you can hit the next slide, and you already did. Our project, which had some planning funding in the spring, is going to start really in earnest in January with a larger contract with the Secretary of State's office. This slide shows you a little bit about what we've been doing to date, and I'm trying to move my screen around here. Like all good pieces of research, the State Auditors Report was really great, very well done, high quality, and like all good work, left us with a lot of promising leads for next steps. So what we've done since the spring with our planning phase, we have been preparing to do some more sophisticated and detailed ballot analysis. We're going to look at both within voter and within county trends over time in ballot rejections. Like the state auditor's report, we will examine variation by age, geography. We are going to include the competitiveness of the election because there's reasons to think that ballot curing efforts may have a different resonance when the elections are closer and than when they are less close. And like the state auditor, we will look at different imputation methods for identifying the race and ethnic composition of the electorate. I should note there, the methods being used by the state auditors are really best practice, best science. And what we hope to do is show results using a few different types of approaches. But given that we aren't a Voting Rights Act state, we don't collect the race and ethnicity of voters. And I think if we're interested in these questions, we're left with these imputation approaches and being very cautious about them, but also thinking about what they imply for practice. We've done a lot of work talking to county election administrators to this point. We've been engaged with a working group. Callie and AJ have been doing some observation with counties. We've been learning about ballot curing processes and observing those as they occur in county offices in the most recent election. We've been planning to do some interviews with county-based organizations. I believe we're going to be meeting with the state auditors team soon. And we have a project advisory board that's composed of kind of key thought leaders. Whitney Quisenberry, the director at the Center for Civic Design. Tammy Patrick, who some of you may know, she's a senior advisor at the Democracy Fund. And then two election scholars, Mike Hanmer from the University of Maryland and Martha Kropp from the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. So currently, we have enough funding to support some of kind of our basic planning work. And then in January, with this contract with Secretary of State, we're going to work more intentionally on some next phases of the project. That's where we'll really start to dig into the voter and county level analysis. One of the things that we've noted from some of the preliminary scans of county data is that the geographically, the percentages of rejected ballots varies quite a bit over time from county to county and region to region. And 2020 is kind of a unique election in some ways compared to others. So we're excited to look at these trends over time. We also are going to start to conduct in-depth interviews with county election staff, again, building on some of the recommendations and insights from the state auditor's report. Again, we'll conduct our community-based organization interviews to understand how community organizations are helping educate voters, maybe even becoming involved in voter curing efforts. And then what we hope to do is use information from the Secretary of State about voters whose ballots were rejected and potentially cured to invite them to participate in our study through a survey or interview process. And we will hope to begin that early in 2023. And then it's important to note that this contract for the Secretary of State's office gets us through June. We are hoping to have a second budget proviso that will allow us to finish the work through November, where we will complete all the analysis of the data, complete analysis of our voter interview and survey data. We are intending and planning to convene our advisory board and some experts, voters, county election officials, anybody who is interested really, and help us work through how we might think about ballot and voter education material redesign. And all that, plus our analysis, will be presented to the legislature about a year from now. So I don't know if the committee has questions right away, but I would love to invite Callie and AJ to just maybe say a few things about what they've observed in counties to this point.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everybody. My name is CALISTA John. I am the Innovation and Engagement Manager based at the Evans School. So like Scott mentioned, this fall, we had the really awesome opportunity to observe elections procedures in 4 counties. And we plan to visit at least one more in the coming months for the special election. So we observed everything from when a ballot was returned to the elections office to its processing, including the signature matching process, as well as the different responses that are taken based on how that ballot is categorized. And then we also even watched some concluding canvassing board meetings. So through this, we really importantly built relationships with some of the auditors and the county elections staff. And we are documenting best practices in the field, like the state auditors, as well as creating a process map of the various juncture points where counties and their practices can differ from one another to hopefully help paint a picture of what the elections process is really like statewide. Also, we are able to interview these experts' opinions on potential directions for the project. So, like also Scott mentioned, we're going to be doing some initial interviews with community organizations, and they do really integral education and outreach work with voters, particularly those key voters that we are currently trying to reach. And they know what that voter experience is really like. So I think I can punt it over to Alexandra, who can also speak to this.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for having us today. As CALISTA and Scott mentioned, my name is Alexandra FOLTZ, and I'm an MPA candidate and Dean's Fellow at the Evans School. I have the immense privilege of working with EPIC on this project, and I'm very excited to share what I gained from visiting specifically Pierce and Whatcom counties and observing ballot reviews. So, a common thread mentioned by both election officials I spoke with was a disconnect between the state level, county level, and the voter when it comes to recommended improvements in the signature verification process. There are variations in practice and different interpretations of the policy between counties, which leads to confusion among county staff and translates to the voter not knowing what's expected when and after they sign their ballot. Callie noted that we were documenting very specific juncture points in the process, but we also took away these broader observations that gave us a better view of the field and will inform our work throughout the next year. I'd like to note as well that we are not collecting hard data on these visits. We observed and documented multiple levels of the signature verification process, discussed ballot curing processes, and watched as machines and staff sorted ballots. But along with this field research, our conversations with county auditors and election officials were extremely valuable. I certainly value speaking directly with those who are implementing policy, as they know best what their offices and voters need. I personally gained a lot of knowledge about the ballot review process by speaking with these election officials, and I'm definitely looking forward to applying this knowledge while working with EPIC and the Washington Secretary of State's office over the next year to reduce ballot rejection rates. Thank you again.
Thank you. I think we have one question from Vice Chair Lekanoff.
Real quick question. When you were taking a look at, and this is for one of the three of you, whichever finds it can answer it, convening around ballot and voter education materials, when you were looking at that, did you see language barriers in the materials that were being shared? And I know for voter pamphlets, there's been a call to action in some of our rural communities to have voter pamphlets be in different languages. But for the voter education material, which might be quite different also, are we finding the language barriers are going to be difficult for us to implement and incorporate?
So we haven't actually held those convenings. That will be in the summer after July. And so, but we've had some preliminary conversations with experts in these spaces, and I think there's a lot of reason to make sure we're doing a really good job translating materials and providing them in accessible ways. One of the things we hope to do with the voter trend analysis is to see if ballot rejections are episodic, maybe they're happening once and then maybe never again, or if they're a recurrent reality. And to the extent we can think about how that matches to the characteristics of voters, we might be able to think through how well we're doing and where with our voting materials.
Thank you. And thank you for correcting me on the date.
Oh, no problem.
Okay, seeing no other questions, we want to thank you for your presentation and all the work that you're doing also on this very important work. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.